And it makes it's actually good it's happening right now.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the afternoon sessions. So I'm really excited to kick off the keynotes and tutorials. If you haven't been to CCN before or aren't familiar with the format, the way this works is we're going to have 3 keynotes during this session, and each of them will have a tutorial later this afternoon that sort of expands upon the topics they discuss. So if you pick one that you're interested in, you can go to those tutorials. They will be occurring in parallel, so you have to choose just one of them. And we ask that if you're going to go, please try to go to the websites and download the materials for the tutorial ahead of time so we don't have 800 people trying to download things at the same time, which might cause some issues. OK, great. So I'm going to start off by introducing the first keynote. And for this keynote, we're going to have Dr. Alex Williams joining us. Dr. Williams is an assistant professor at NYU and an associate research scientist at the Flatiron Institute. And his work over the years has worked on how to quantify sort of trial-to-trial variability and disentangle what's happening within a neuronal population in an animal across time and across experimental trials, up to theoretical questions about what kind of metrics and measures we should use to compare between different neuronal populations. And that's what he's going to tell us about today. Please join me in welcoming him.
All right, thanks, Andrew. OK. Really excited for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm going to give an overview on quantifying similarity between high-dimensional neural population codes. And I'm excited to speak about this because I think it's really sits at the heart of a lot of the questions that this community is interested in. And not only that, I think a lot of the people who are pioneers in this kind of thinking are sitting in the audience here today. So I'm excited to share my latest thoughts on this problem and maybe give you a couple hot takes along the way, too. Before we get into that, I want to start by making sure I thank everybody who needs to be thanked. In particular, I want to thank the 4 co-organizers of the tutorial portion of this K&T session. So thank you to Sarah, Tare, Heiko, and Nico for giving lots of feedback and helping develop a set of Jupyter notebooks, which we're going to distribute and go through together as a group. And there's really far too many people that I need to thank for shaping my thinking on the set of topics I'm going to tell you about. So I'm just highlighting a number of people, co-authors as well as collaborators outside of my group who we've had great conversations on this set of topics and worked together on this. So thank you to all these people. OK, so I'm interested in this topic of quantifying similarity in neural representations or neural population codes because I have a deep-seated belief that in order to understand complicated biological systems, we need to lean very heavily on a comparative lens or perspective. And if you take a broad view of the field of biology, I think the importance of comparisons is really undeniable. It really is fundamental to how we understand how animals operate in naturalistic, complex environments, all the way down to how we understand the function and structure of individual proteins and how point mutations change the phenotypes of animals. So across biology, I think comparisons are very important. And in neuroscience, they're also obviously important and form a lot of the fundamental understanding of our field. So on an anatomical level, our understanding of different the functional purpose of different brain areas is built on lesion experiments and comparisons across species, and also drawing homologous anatomical comparisons across species. So in many ways, this comparative lens is already with us as neuroscientists. But I'm here today to make the case that we can push this a little bit further in the era of large-scale systems neuroscience and cognitive computational neuroscience. So what do I mean by this new era of comparative cognitive computational neuroscience? So I mean this in a very broad sense, that we should be pushing ourselves to think about comparing neural representations across different species performing similar tasks, looking at what makes them different and what makes them similar. Also, within an individual subject, making comparisons across recordings from different brain regions, which are thought to be functionally specialized for different roles. And then finally, also making comparisons within a species across individuals is something that I think there's a little bit of work on, but it's something that we've really only scratched the surface of as a field. And I think this is really important if you want to ultimately relate what we're doing back to things like neural disorders and disease, because if we don't understand what are the kind of healthy ranges of variability across a healthy population, we're not going to be able to pinpoint what is different in a diseased versus a healthy state. So all of these things I would say we're interested in working on, and I think it's fair to say that although a number of studies have started to take first steps in each of these three areas, there's still a lot of work to be done. And what I'll tell you about is the set of kind of fundamental statistical methods that can be unified across all three of these areas, and we'll unpack exactly how those methods work and maybe how to rigorously interpret them. But this is something that I think is going to be ongoing for years to come. And with that in mind, I want to highlight two recent trends within the field, which I think poise us to make really big advances in this area over the next 5 or so years. So the first thing that I would point to is the emergence of these very large-scale public data sets that are being collected by initiatives like the International Brain Laboratory, other initiatives at the Allen Institute, and in the human neuroimaging community, there's a number of public data sets, large-scale public data sets with many subjects also coming out. All of these things I think are fundamentally important because if you want to reliably or confidently characterize animal-to-animal variability, you need to have enough statistical power to be able to isolate that true biological variability from measurement noise or other uncontrolled forms of variability. So I think we're finally getting to the point where the data sets we have access to as a field are at the scale necessary to tackle those questions. And at the same time, there's been an explosion of computational modeling approaches to make sense of these data sets. And a lot of them and a lot of the work at this conference is now centering on these deep network models, which come in a really wide variety of architectures, spanning convolutional architectures as well as transformers. And all of these architectures can perform extremely well on tasks if you provide them enough data and train them for long enough. So I think that these models are interesting to study in their own right and draw comparisons across these architectures amongst themselves as well as to the brain is a core part of what I'm going to talk about. Okay, and then finally, I think we're poised to make a lot of advances in this area because we're building on a lot of fundamental existing methods and insights that have come from this community already. So I'm not going to go through a history of these ideas in this 30-minute talk, but I just want to give a brief nod to the fact that we as a community have been thinking about this on some level for many years. Okay, so what I want to do next is walk you through some concrete examples to give you a flavor of the kind of analyses and questions that we would like to be able to answer with this set of tools. So in the first example I'm going to walk you through is a comparison of population-level visual responses in 55 brain regions across mice. So we're pooling neural recordings across multiple subjects in this analysis. This is data that's released by the Allen Institute under the Allen Brain Observatory. And it's a 2-minute clip of a naturalistic movie. And the data sets look something like the heat map here on the left. This is an example of 100 neurons, basically estimated trial average firing rates over time in auditory cortex. So even though this isn't visual cortex, you can maybe see that there's reliable visual responses in this cortical area. Okay, so this is just one of the brain regions we looked at. We looked at all brain regions that had at least 50 identified neurons. And this is the full data set that is available to us. So I just want you to appreciate here, I mean, obviously we have visual cortical areas over here, but again, auditory cortex and other thalamic areas as well as somatosensory cortex seem to have visual responses. So this is a very rich and complicated data set. There's basically 55 high-dimensional, multi-dimensional time series. And we want to make sense of it. And what I'm going to talk about today is thinking about ways of boiling down data sets like this into a distance matrix like this. So if there's 55 brain regions, you would have a 55 by 55 symmetric distance matrix. Element ij in this distance matrix is somehow a quantification of how similar the firing rate statistics are between brain region I and brain region j. And again, the community has kind of developed methods to do these quantifications before, and in the second half of the talk, we'll get into some more specifics. But for now, we're just going to think about, we're just going to assume that we have access to this distance matrix. Okay, so this summarizes how similar and how different all the different brain regions are from each other, and what can we do with it once we compute it. So one thing you can do is you can perform basically a vector embedding by a technique called multidimensional scaling, followed by PCA to get a 2-dimensional embedding that looks like this. So each point in this low-dimensional space corresponds to a different brain region, and I've labeled all the brain regions for you here and colored them according to their anatomical coloring in the Allen Brain Reference Atlas. And what I think that you can probably appreciate immediately is that all of the cortical areas in teal kind of clustered together on the right side of this low-dimensional plot. The pink areas, the visual thalamic areas in pink, are kind of clustered in the middle. And then there's a cluster on the left here, which is mostly non-visually responsive areas. If you look closer, you'll see that the primary visual cortex clusters together, auditory cortex clusters together, and somatosensory cortex clusters together, roughly speaking at least. So this is a nice result because we did all of this analysis at the level of the functional neural responses to this movie clip. But when we put them in this low-dimensional space, reflecting their distance properties, we see a recapitulation of what we already suspected about the network based on neuroanatomy. Okay? So that's comparing different neural population codes across brain regions. Now I want to give you an example of comparing across animals from the same brain region. So this is data from Adrian Perrache's group, head direction cells in postsubiculum. So these are neurons that fire when the animal is facing a certain direction, giving you tuning curves similar to the top here. And they have recordings in 30 different mice from this brain area, and we're showing you here principal component analysis projections for all 30 of these mice separately. So unsurprisingly, because this is a one-dimensional periodic variable, you get a low-dimensional ring manifold in all of these animals. But you can probably see that the geometry of this low-dimensional summary plot is different across animals. OK, so applying the method that I was alluding to in the previous slide, computing all the pairwise distances across animals and finding a low-dimensional embedding, we get something that looks like this. So again, each dot here is one mouse. And now we're coloring the dots by the average width of the tuning curves in each one of these recordings that we made. So you can see that there is animal-to-animal variability, and most of that variability seems to be explainable by some animals having sharper tuning curves than other animals. And I'm not going to get too deep into the details here, but we can do various cross-validation approaches to convince ourselves that this animal-to-animal variability we're isolating with this approach is real. So you can fit or calculate the distance metric on a subset of neurons and a subset of time points, and then test to see if it generalizes to a non-overlapping set of time points as well as a non-overlapping set of inputs. And when you do this, you see that the distances within an animal tend to be smaller than the distances between animals. So there does seem to be real signal that we're able to measure in a data set like this, which is exciting. Okay, I'm going to give you another example of looking at analyses across animals now. This is now an analysis of 20 mice from the International Brain Lab data set. So these are mice performing a task. The details of that task don't matter too much. It's a sensory discrimination task. But each mouse's behavior is characterized by a psychometric curve that looks something like this. The orange here is the average, and the gray is the individual mice. So you can see that there's a lot of animal-to-animal variability in the behavior. And we can quantify how similar the behavior of two mice are, and also quantify, as I've done in the previous slides, how similar their neural representations are. So the neural distances are shown in black, whereas the behavioral distances are shown in purple, and we can ask to see, is there a relationship here? And we find that there is one, that if you look at animals who are close together in terms of their neural representations, they tend to have more similar behavioral responses. And this is even though the behavioral responses are somewhat limited in their resolution because there's a limited number of trials in this data set. But we're still able to pull out this pretty significant correlation. Okay, so I like this example because it's showing it's not just quantifying, putting a number on how similar this animal is to this animal, but actually showing that there's some behavioral relevance to the structure that we're able to pull out with these techniques. Okay, and then finally, I want to quickly mention that we are interested in applying this approach to deep artificial networks as well as to biological data. So in the machine learning community, there's a lot of interest in using deep networks for nonlinear dimensionality reduction. But as you might guess, given the ballooning size of the machine learning field, there's a lot of different approaches for doing this. So in this analysis, we're taking data from this paper from Locatello et al., published in 2019. We're taking 1,800 variational autoencoder deep network models. And this is just showing that you can scale up the analyses I've been talking about to these very large scales. We are looking at now 1,800 by 1,800 distance matrices. So there's, roughly speaking, on the order of 1 million distance computations going on in this very large matrix. Okay? And again, you can do low-dimensional embeddings as well as, nearest neighbor predictions and clustering analyses on data sets like this. Here I'm just showing you, the eye candy, the low-dimensional embedding. Each dot is a network, and we're coloring the networks by the particular objective function that they were optimized according to. So you see that there's some similarities across these different paradigms and also some differences because the colors do separate from each other. Okay, so in all of those examples I just showed you, the backbone of it looks a little bit like this. So the raw data that we're working with is neural responses in a high-dimensional space. So you have n neurons across some number of stimulus conditions, m stimulus conditions. And importantly, we're collecting the responses not just to a single network, but a large cohort of networks and want to draw comparisons. There's a number of things that you might want to do with data sets like this. I've talked a lot about visualizing these in low-dimensional spaces. You can also think about running clustering algorithms to try to find clusters of networks with similar representations. Or you can think about predicting attributes of a network like its behavioral performance given its relation to all the other K networks. And there's various other fancy things you can do, like averaging and computing variances within this space of representations, which I'm not going to get too far into. But there's a lot of potential here, and most all of these can be thought of or fit within the framework of first computing this K by K distance matrix between all the different networks. Once you have that distance matrix, you can pass it to various open source software packages like scikit-learn has, for example, dimensionality reduction routines with multidimensional scaling, clustering methods that work with distance matrices like agglomerative clustering, as well as k-nearest neighbor prediction and regression algorithms. And there's many other tools that could also fit under this category. Okay, so this is a pretty flexible framework, and once you have the distance matrix, there's a lot of existing tools already built by other data science and machine learning communities that we can take advantage of. So that brings us to this point of how do we compute the distance matrix, which is something that, again, there's many ways to do this, and is probably something that there's going to be a continued discussion and debate to some extent within the community. But I'm going to put forward the perspective that for a lot of these downstream analyses that I've been talking about, it's useful to have notions of distance that satisfy a couple rigorous criteria. So the first is that I want the distance between network X and network Y to be 0 if and only if these networks meet some pre-specified equivalence condition. Like, for example, I can do a rotation and that change of basis relates the two networks perfectly. The second condition that I want to meet is that the distance is symmetric. So the distance from X to Y is the same as the distance from network Y to X. And then the third and usually most difficult one to satisfy is this triangle inequality, which says that the direct distance between network X and network Z is always minimal. So that's always less than the distance if I go from X to Y to Z. Okay, so the question you might immediately ask is, why go to all this bother of defining a formal metric space? And the answer I'd give is that many of the analyses that I was showing you before, such as finding a low-dimensional embedding or performing clustering, really only make rigorous sense, at least within a metric space. So, for example, let's think about what happens when the triangle inequality gets violated. When the triangle inequality is violated, basically means that you can have two things happening at once. You can have network X is close to network Y, and network Y is close to network Z. But at the same time, X and Z are very far apart from each other. Okay? And this poses a bit of a paradox for clustering algorithms, because the configuration of points on the left would suggest that X should be in the same cluster as Y, and Y should be in the same cluster as Z. But the configuration of points on the right would suggest that X and Z should be put into different clusters because they're far apart. So there's this like kind of transitive notion of a cluster. The transitive property gets broken when the triangle inequality gets violated. The triangle inequality also makes it really easy for me to find the nearest neighbors for each point in my metric space. So if you think about each of these points as being a network that I'm analyzing, I can color each network by a dependent variable I want to predict, for example, the behavioral performance of the network. And then let's say I go and do a new neural recording. So I measure a new network representation. I can find out where it lives in this space, and then compute distances and define all of the other networks that are within some region anchored on this individual animal. If I violate the triangle inequality, I need to look at sort of all paths to find my nearest neighbors, whereas the triangle inequality means I can just compute individual distances from this blue point to all the red points and rank order them to find my nearest neighbors. Okay, so that means it's easy to find my nearest neighbors, and then if I want to predict the performance of this network, I just take the average of the dependent variable for all the red points within this blue circle, for example. Okay, so this is why having the triangle inequality and a proper metric space is nice. The next question you might ask is, do common similarity measures that have been used for the past 10 years define metric spaces? And the answer is that many don't. Some of them are pretty close. But this is the point of the talk where I have to give a public service announcement to make sure that people are aware of some of the subtleties and pitfalls to what I'm talking about here. So an example of a metric that quantifies some notion of similarity between two systems is linear regression. But linear regression is not, if you just look at the raw R² score, a symmetric measure. So here's an example of two networks, X and Y. In this example, X is a much higher dimensional representation, so when I try to predict Y from X, I get an R squared very close to 1. But if I try to predict X from Y, the R squared is 0.1, and in general, it can be arbitrarily close to 0. So you can symmetrize linear regression by taking the average of these two numbers, and that helps to some extent, but it doesn't get you all the way there to satisfying the triangle inequality. So this is just a cautionary note that when we're putting numbers on how similar two networks are, it really depends on the question that you're trying to ask. If you just care about predictivity and you want to predict responses in network Y on out-of-sample images, then R squared is the correct way to think about that. But if you want to think about distance comparisons across a large number of networks, I would argue that if you want these distances to be self-consistent with each other, you need to think about slightly different notions of distance. OK, so this brings me to one notion of distance that I'm quite fond of called the Procrustes shape distance. And you can think about this as being a constrained linear prediction score, not unlike the R squared. So here we have measurements from an animal X and neural responses in an animal Y, these matrices that I've been showing you before. And we're going to try to fit a linear transformation that maps X onto Y, but we're going to constrain that linear transformation Q to be an orthogonal matrix, so it's a rotation and a reflection. So the overall Procrustes distance score looks like this. If you look at that, it looks very close to a linear regression, because it is. Geometrically, you can think of each of these neural representations as points in a neural firing rate space. So if you have m stimulus conditions, you have m points in this n-dimensional space. And because the neurons are not one-to-one matched to each other a priori, you need to fit some sort of alignment between them. And the Procrustes distance is fitting a rotational alignment to them. OK, so this is one notion of distance. It turns out to be symmetric, and it also turns out to satisfy the triangle inequality. So I'm not showing that for you here, but it's actually not too difficult to prove. One of the things I really like about this is that it generalizes itself in many nice ways. So I told you about the Procrustes distance, which is a notion of distance that is invariant to rotations of the neural response. But what if I want to be invariant to a more general linear mapping between the two? Well, I can start by performing a whitening pre-processing step. So if I do that separately on X and Y, that means that the neurons by neurons covariance matrix in each of these network representations is the identity matrix. And then I can play the same game of fitting the rotational alignment on these pre-processed representations. And when I do this, I get a different number, which happens to be closely related to canonical correlations analysis. So this also satisfies the triangle inequality and is symmetric. But now we're not invariant only to rotations. We're invariant to a more general class of invertible linear mappings. And you can play that game in many other ways. So right here, I started by telling you about distance 2, rotational invariance. And then I just showed you how to get a linear invariant metric. That's distance 3. But you can go in the other direction and add more constraints onto the problem and say, I don't want to allow general rotations. I want to force there to be a one-to-one matching or permutation of neurons across the two networks. So that's also possible within this framework, and that gives you a metric, which we've called soft matching distance. And you can also go further in the other direction and ask for smooth nonlinear mappings to match these two. So I think that this is a very broad framework that can accommodate a lot of different perspectives on what is a good distance metric. And work in my group and in collaboration with others is looking at individual examples within this broader family. OK, and then lastly, I just want to also mention a connection between the Procrustes shape distance and representational similarity analysis and centered kernel alignment. So this is, as many of you maybe heard in Sarah's talk this morning, another very popular framework for comparing neural representations that really grew out of this community and work by Nico and others. And what's somewhat remarkable is that the Procrustes distance is special in that you can compute it the way I was telling you, but you can also compute it in terms of these condition by conditions representational similarity matrices or kernel matrices. So the expression here on the right, it's not immediately obvious to you why these two things should be the case, but it does end up being the case and ends up being not too difficult to prove. So you can go to Sarah's poster tomorrow if you want to, ask details about the reason this is true. So again, I think the reason I'm bringing this up is that I don't think we're making too many compromises. We can develop a broad family of distance metrics using the framework I'm telling you about, and also we don't have to leave behind things that are very comfortable and have been used by the field before. A lot of these things are really closely related. Okay, so I'll conclude by giving a couple take-home messages, what I've told you about. So I hope I've convinced you that we're living in a really exciting time where experiments are getting to a scale and a level of, they're not too expensive to the point where we can collect lots of data from many different animals, and this scale is necessary if we're going to be able to disentangle comparisons between animals from kinds of measurement noise. So I think this is an emerging opportunity that I'm very excited about. Also, I've made the case that if we're going to make comparisons rigorously across a large number of networks, not just 2 at a time, it's very useful to have all the conditions of a proper metric space for downstream analyses. So for example, if we want to run clustering algorithms, it's very useful to have the triangle inequality. And I've also mentioned that there's not just a single metric that we're betting all of our money on. We're trying to provide a very wide menu of different approaches to address different perspectives and scientific questions within the community. And then I concluded by telling you that there's also really nice connections between this framework and representational similarity analysis. There's many things that I didn't have time to put into this talk, and I'd love to have conversations about this afterwards with any of you. One thing that's really important is understanding statistically how many stimulus conditions we need to sample in order to get an accurate estimate of the true distance between 2 animals. So this is something that we addressed in the paper that I'm highlighting here. Similarly to asking how many conditions do we need to sample, in biological data sets we should also ask the question how many neurons do we need to sample in order to estimate these distances accurately. This is something we're actively working on. Also, throughout this talk, I've kind of glossed over the fact that neural responses are very stochastic and noisy. So I've been looking at trial averaged responses in all the analyses I've shown you. But we're also very interested in thinking about how does noise factor into neural representations and neural computation, and this is something that we've looked at in this paper and shown how to extend the Procrustes distance to noisy stochastic representations. Another thing that I have oversimplified in this talk is by thinking about neural representations as just kind of a single point in firing rate space, but in reality, neural computations are dynamically unfolding over time. And we're interested in also extending Procrustes distance and other distance metrics to look at dynamic computations in recurrent network models, as well as in the brain. So that's also something that you should stay tuned for. So I hope to come back in a few years and give you all the updates. Thanks.
Thanks for the great talk. I'm wondering for...
Speak closer to the mic. Sorry, it's hard up here. I think it's a dead zone on the...
Sorry about that. Thanks for the great talk. I'm wondering what guidance you have for data sets that have already been collected where people might not have had collected the right number of neurons, the right amount of data, so historical data. What kind of analyses?
So historical data, can we say anything about? Yeah, I think the specifics of that are going to depend on the data set and also the specifics of this work, which we have some results on, but some of it is still ongoing. So I probably can't give a satisfying answer right now. But my guess is a lot of the historical data sets are not going to be sufficient. We're not going to have statistical power.
Thanks for a good talk. I have a philosophical question. Do you think there's one distance metric to rule them all, and maybe we have or haven't found it yet? Or do you think the kind of metric that we should look at depends on the kind of question that we're interested in?
That's a great question. I don't generally like philosophical questions, or I feel like I'm not qualified to answer them. But my thinking much more aligns with the second thing that you said, that there's not going to be a single distance metric to rule them all, but there's a variety of different metrics that tell you different things. And in fact, like if I go back to, let's see, like this here shows a number of different metrics that we've developed. Some of these are like lower bounds on the other one. So if you fit a rotation to align two networks and then measure their distance that way, that's going to give you a smaller distance than if you fit a permutation, because a permutation is a special case of a rotation. So I think one thing I've been interested in a while, but we haven't really done it in an analysis yet, is look at what are the gaps between these various different metrics. So Meenakshi, and in collaboration with Nancy Kandwisher and Josh McDermott, has been looking at these permutation matching algorithms and showing that they find a small distance between deep nets and the brain, smaller than you would get by chance. But comparing that explicitly to some of these other models or all these other metrics would be very interesting. So I think this is a rambling answer, but I think by looking at all the metrics rather than just a single distance metric, you're going to get more of a fingerprint of, a detailed fingerprint of that particular representation that you're comparing.
Thank you for your very impressive talk. Actually, you just partially answered my question. Because in mathematics, almost all the metrics are somewhat equivalent, but in computational sense, different metric may reveal different kind of geometry locally. So I'm wondering, like, say, what kind of downstream analysis or what kind of downstream tasks can these shape distance benefit?
I got most of that, but I'm sorry, it's hard to hear up here for some reason. You said computational. What are the computational challenges?
Yeah, or what kind of downstream tasks these shape distance will solve finally, and compare to the existing this kind of metric?
Yeah, so what downstream tasks, like I mentioned, clustering and nearest neighbor regression, this is what you mean by downstream tasks, yeah?
I mean, in addition to these kind of mathematically defined downstream tasks, what kind of, for example, neuroscience question can be answered with this specific?
Well, yeah, I think there's a broad number of neuroscience questions that you can get at with these downstream tasks like clustering and regression. So something I'm very interested in is just characterizing what is like the healthy range of individual variability in neural representations across animals. I think this is something that we don't have a good handle on. So just characterizing that, I think, would be of interest to a neuroscientist.
Okay, then can you maybe give us some intuition, like say why it can characterize better? Like say, or in what sense it's better?
Better than what? I'm not sure I understand the question. Better than what?
I mean, because one can definitely define different kind of metric, right? And some maybe follow more strictly with the definition of metric in mathematics. But regarding this shape distance, what kind of specific property it can characterize better than the others?
Yeah, so I think the advantage of the shape distances and related metrics is the fact that they actually satisfy a triangle inequality. So a lot of the not too much work until recently has started to use metrics with this property.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, yeah, really interesting talk. Often we have like issues with like confounds in our stimulus distributions, and we want not just like the first order relationships, but like conditional relationships where we control for other kinds of things that we think are less interesting. I'm wondering how these kinds of techniques you've talked about can accommodate the kinds of things we would do if we had like an encoding model and we could do multiple regression where we control for.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I just kind of lumped all experimental conditions into a list of M conditions, so everything fits in a nice matrix, but you're saying that really, I mean, there might be like hierarchical structure, or yeah, there's conditions over time and things like this. Yeah, great question. I think, so I don't, again, know if I can give a satisfying answer, but I think that this framework is pretty flexible, and you can definitely incorporate things like that. So maybe that's a question that is better taken offline, but it's a good one.
I thank you for the talk. So you're arguing that having a proper metric is useful for downstream analysis because of mathematical convenience of mathematical machinery you want to use, and that because you have difficulties interpreting certain relationships that do not match like Euclidean intuitions that you have. But at the end of the day, you are postulating and talking about representational geometries. And then you say you have a distance, a way of calculating distance that is metric, but you can give different constraints, so it does completely very different things, like achieving rotational equivalence, but possibly you can add other constraints that will disregard certain other aspects of the patterns. So then, if the whole deal here is to represent stuff as distance matrices, and then it all becomes a fundamental function of the choice of distance metric, then the question of what is the right distance metric becomes absolutely fundamental. And it's a conversation that needs to be had and resolved, because at least in some problems that I've addressed, there is clearly a bad metric and a correct metric. Now, there might be very different problems, and they might have different metrics. So if that problem is not addressed, the fact that there's mathematical convenience in a proper metric is, in my view, secondary. So I want you to...
Yeah. So I guess I'm definitely interested in having that conversation about choosing between these various metrics. In everything that I've seen so far, I've never seen the need, personally, this is just my view, to compromise and say that we need to sacrifice the triangle inequality and sacrifice symmetry, for example, and not be able to obtain other desired properties that people want in metrics. So that's been my experience so far, but I'm open to hearing your perspective on that. I think Andrew's coming to yank me off.
I can show you a couple of examples later then.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think there's some important discussions to be had here, and unfortunately we might have to take them offline so we can have the next talk.
Yeah.
So it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Jack Lindsey. Dr. Lindsey completed his PhD in theoretical neuroscience at Columbia University, where he did some fascinating work on both in natural and artificial neurons, what kind of representations they learn depending on task structure and more. And today he's going to tell us about some exciting advances in interpretability for deep neural networks. Please join me in welcoming him.
One sec, sorry. Right. Awesome. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Whoops. Thanks, Andrew, and the organizers for letting me speak here. So I work on the interpretability team at Anthropic, which is an AI company that builds large language and other models and tries to do so in a safe, reliable way. And we think interpretability is part of that mission. And I'm excited to talk to you about some of our recent work and the field of language model interpretability more broadly. First, why work on this stuff? I think the case is pretty simple. Large language models, if you aren't aware, can do many things, many impressive things, and are being applied in all sorts of different domains and products and industries. And that trend is, likely to increase as the models continue to become more and more capable. But But these models are also strange and alien and suffer from kind of bizarre failure modes that are weird from a human perspective. You can jailbreak models, get them to break character or produce harmful outputs when they might, when they've been trained not to. Sometimes models hallucinate and make stuff up. Sometimes they'll second guess themselves even when they got a correct answer. Sometimes they'll say things that are tailored to please a user, even when you might not want them to do that. And we don't really know why, at a kind of gears level, they do any of these things. It's all poorly understood. And you put all this together, it's kind of a dangerous combination. If these models are capable enough that people are incentivized to deploy them in many applications, but they're still brittle or not robust or produce outputs that are wrong or harmful, that could lead to lots of bad outcomes. So we hope that improving on the basic science of interpretability will help mitigate these failure modes. But of course, this is a neuroscience conference, not a machine learning conference. So yeah, why might the CCN audience be interested in language model interpretability? It's a good question. Who knows why I'm here? But if I had to make a case for it, I would say, number one, a necessary condition for understanding how the brain supports behaviors is having at least one model that can do the behavior, or at least one computational model that can do the behavior. And for a lot of things, certainly not everything, but for a lot of kind of sophisticated cognitive capabilities, like doing math problems or programming or multi-step like inferences, language models are kind of the only or best game in town. And so they're kind of all we have for now. Second reason to care about studying these models is that they provide a kind of practice ground for neuroscience and cognitive science research. Deep learning interpretability is kind of neuroscience on easy mode. You can record whatever you want. You can ask the model whatever you want. And despite that unfettered access, we struggle to understand these systems. And I suspect if we make progress on these models, it will help point us in the right direction for studying the brain, give us a sense of the kinds of analyses we ultimately are going to need to be running when designing experiments for animals or humans. Okay, so that brings us to the motivating question of this talk, which is, what kinds of abstractions do large language models represent, and how do they represent them? To answer this question, we have to make some educated guesses. And one of those guesses is the so-called linear representation hypothesis, the claim that neural networks represent semantically meaningful variables linearly in their activation space. And there are some kind of hand-wavy theoretical reasons you might suspect this should be at least kind of true. The majority of computation in deep learning models is spent conducting linear transformations, so maybe it's kind of easiest for them to work with linearly represented information, but it's a bit of fuzzy reasoning, and ultimately this is an empirical question. But the empirical evidence suggests that to kind of a shocking degree, language models do represent kind of a surprising number of things linearly in their activation space. And not just in the kind of decoding sense that you can fit a linear regression and like decode, facets of the prompt that you input to the model, but also even in kind of like a causally relevant sense where you can perturb model activations along linear directions and it will influence the output in interpretable ways. Kind of a striking example is this Lee et al. Paper where they found like a truth direction and could, if you like nudge the model in the truth direction, it's more likely to produce true statements when you ask it to factual questions. There's an issue, which is that, accepting this kind of linear representations idea puts us in an awkward position because it raises the question, how could these models possibly represent so many things linearly at once without interference? There's too many things in the world to represent them, to give each one its own neuron, or each one its own like orthogonal direction in a vector space. So how do they do it? And the way this can work is an idea that people have sort of started to pick up on in the last few years that's come to be known as superposition. Superposition refers to the fact that in n-dimensional space can linearly represent many, many more than n variables without much interference if, and kind of only if, they are sparse, in the sense that they are 0 most of the time, but occasionally take on non-zero values. So in this picture, we have 5 variables embedded along 5 axes in a 2-dimensional space. And if we imagine that they're sparsely active, like if only one of these kind of variables is pushing along its axis at a time, it would actually be pretty easy to linearly decode which one it is. Whereas if all 5 were active and we summed them all up along these different vectors, it would be kind of a mess. So sparsity allows you to pack in a lot more information in a much smaller space. And this isn't kind of a new insight. It's like the foundation of the field of compressed sensing, for example. But I think it's only recently people have started to really reckon with this idea in the context of understanding representations in neural networks. One thing to ask is, why should we expect the things that we care about, these kind of like ground truth, like generating variables or features underlying our observations, to be sparse? And this is definitely it's not a fact, it's not a theorem, it's really just an intuition. But it's an important intuition to have, or at least to understand why some people have it. And the intuition is that, like, man, the world has just got a lot of stuff in it. Like, there's like bananas, there's like the weather, there's like flying, there's recursive algorithms, there's punctuation marks. Like, that's just, that's 5 things, but I could list billions of things. But at any given time, the probability that I'm talking about one of these things is very low. I spend most of my life, with no bananas around me, not doing recursive algorithms, et cetera. So my description of the world, though, would be incomplete without any of these things. They all have their moment where they really are the star of the show. And so that's where this intuition comes from, that we're looking for this kind of like really high-dimensional set of variables that are like only occasionally relevant to any given context. Okay, so what this kind of leads us to is a hypothesis that when you're looking at a trained deep learning model, or perhaps when you're looking at a brain, you can think of it as trying to simulate a much larger model where each of the neurons is sparsely active and corresponds to some kind of interpretable latent variable underlying the data. And the challenge we face is to figure out how to infer this like upstairs model from the real model that we see, and then we hope that the upstairs model will be more interpretable. So how can we do that? Remember that this whole hypothesis rests on the assumptions that the hypothetical interpretable features in this bigger model are sparsely active. And so that kind of tells us what optimization problem we need to solve to infer what they are. We want to take our observed activations, and we want to infer from them a higher dimensional, sparser set of activations from which we could linearly reconstruct the observations that we see. And this is exactly what a sparse autoencoder does. So to be more concrete, what is a sparse autoencoder? You're trying to learn these latent factors. We're going to call them features. That's like the term of art these days. And you want them to be able to linearly reconstruct your inputs, x, via decoder weights, W decoder. And in principle, you could use whatever complicated mapping you wanted to infer the feature activations from the observations x. In practice, we're going to use a shallow, like 1 layer's worth of neural network, so a linear transformation plus a ReLU. And that's been working well for us so far. And you ask 2 things of this system. You ask it to, 1, minimize the reconstruction error. You want it to be able to recapitulate the observations. And 2, you ask it to make the feature activations sparse, which historically we've achieved using an L1 penalty on feature activations, although recently there's been a lot of work suggesting there's probably better ways to do this that don't involve an L1 penalty, but we'll stick with the basic version for now. And yeah, so there is a kind of whole field of people working on sparse autoencoders for interpretability now. It's really taken off in the last year. And it's definitely a big focus of our group at Anthropic and elsewhere. So yeah, I'm going to focus on our team's work, but because it's what I can speak to best, but I don't mean to give the impression that we have invented all these ideas or the only ones working on this, because it is kind of a bustling space these days. Okay, so for some context, before I joined the team, so I had nothing to do with this, the Anthropic team published this big paper on initial explorations applying sparse autoencoders to small language models, like a one-layer transformer. And these, it was kind of done as a proof of concept. And the really cool finding of this paper was that when you do this, sort of magically, the features learned by the sparse autoencoder seemed to correspond, at least in many cases, to interpretable concepts. So they found stuff like this. Like what they would do is you look at the data set examples, and remember there aren't that many because each feature is sparse. You look at the data set examples that activate a feature, and you see if there's an easily discernible pattern. And so this is an example from the paper of a feature that activates on Arabic text. This is one that activates on like DNA nucleotide sequences. You can see sometimes things get a little fuzzy at the like lower activation values. But for the most part, there's kind of a pattern that describes the set of data points for which this feature activates. And yeah, the paper had a lot of other cool stuff that I'm glossing over for the sake of time. Yeah, one kind of limitation of the findings was that all of the features that were found were kind of like things like this, like maybe patterns in like character strings or like words, or maybe like a collection of related phrases, or like words in certain contexts, but no kind of really deep abstractions. And that's because, as I mentioned, this work was being conducted on a one-layer transformer model, which if you've like hung out with a one-layer transformer, like you know they're no fun. They like can't do anything besides a bit of pattern matching. So there's this big open question. If you run sparse autoencoders on like a powerful state-of-the-art language model, can they uncover features whose kind of like sophistication is commensurate with the model capabilities? So that's what we tested in this recent paper. What we did was we just massively scaled up the infrastructure for training sparse autoencoders to apply them to Claude 3 Sonnet, which until recently was one of Anthropic's publicly deployed models. Of course, it's now been made obsolete because that's how this world works, but we had our moment. And yeah, so a lot of difficult engineering work went into this, most of which I had no involvement in. But conceptually, what we did was like pretty simple. We just trained a few different sparse autoencoders on the activations from like the middle layer of this model. So really nothing like conceptually difficult. And okay, so now for the fun stuff. What did we find? And that's mostly what this talk is about, is trying to put you inside the head of this model a little bit, and you know, start feeling what kinds of abstractions it's formed. Okay, so as we mentioned, a useful way to assess whether a feature represents a meaningful concept or not, or at least one part of doing so, is to look at the inputs that cause it to activate and see if they fit a pattern. So this example is a feature that we deemed a Golden Gate Bridge feature because it fires on discussions of the Golden Gate Bridge. Amazingly, it also activates in response to images of the Golden Gate Bridge, even though we actually didn't even use any image data to train the autoencoder. The model takes in images, but we didn't. It was kind of an afterthought for us, but strikingly, the features we found were still often multimodal. And okay, so it's one thing to find a pattern in the inputs that activate a feature, but to be really confident that you know like what it represents or what its function in the network is, you need to causally validate that interpretation in some way. So what we did in that work was what we called feature steering, which is just applying a perturbation along the feature's embedding direction and seeing how it influences the model's outputs. And this like produced some pretty fun results. Hopefully this is readable, but yeah, by like nudging the model activations along this feature direction, you can get it, in this case, to claim that it is the Golden Gate Bridge when you ask it, like, what is it? And yeah, some of you might have seen we like released this like Golden Gate-ified version of the model as like a meme demo for a few days, and there were lots of like fun user interactions that resulted. But okay, so this is an interesting example of interesting kind of feature because it's so like specific and concrete. Like it's kind of wild that there's like one direction in the model that corresponds to this one object in the world. we also found more abstract features. I like this example a lot of code errors. We initially, discovered this by seeing a feature that activated on a typo in a block of code. So here the word write is like misspelled in a function definition, and then this feature fires on the typo and like everything following it. But then we found that the same feature activates on like trying to divide by 0 in a block of code, or of providing like an invalid input to a function that's supposed to, providing an int to a function that's supposed to take in strings. So it seems to be representing the like, things that would produce code errors in kind of a robust way. And then we found like if you steer in the direction of this feature, if you put in some code that like is totally fine, has no bugs in it or anything, that normally the model would like complete with what the code would output, it'll cause the model to hallucinate an error and print out an error message even though there wasn't really an error. And you can do the opposite of this. You can steer along the negative of the feature vector and induce the opposite behavior. Here we've input code that has a typo in it, which on the left, like normal Claude would correctly identify as having an error and predict an error message. But when you steer in the like negative code error direction, the model is like blinded to the error and thinks that everything is fine. Just going to go through a few more fun examples. So here is a feature that activates on descriptions of people keeping secrets or being discreet. If you crank it up, you can cause the model to start acting shady. So this is an example where the model's deciding whether or not to confess to a mistake that it's made. Normally, it would choose to be upfront about the mistake because we've hopefully trained it to be like transparent and honest, but you can override that instinct by steering along this feature direction. Here's a feature that activates on descriptions of people giving praise to each other in like disingenuous or sycophantic way. I love this example. If you steer with this feature, here what we've done is the user is claiming that they came up with a new phrase, stop and smell the roses, which of course is a well-known phrase. So by default, Claude explains to the user like, hey, that's a cool phrase, but you didn't come up with it. But steering the sycophancy feature, and it goes into this long paragraph about how smart the user is. Last one for now. This is an example that activates on instances of doing insecure things in code, like disabling security settings. And even activates in response to screenshots of people disabling security settings in their browser. And kind of amazingly, if you crank up this feature and ask it to complete a block of code, it can cause it to inject small bugs that would pose security vulnerabilities. So if you're a C programmer, you'll recognize that the code on the right has an off by 1 error that would lead to a buffer overflow, which is kind of like a classic example of a target for security exploits. Okay, so before moving on to the next section, I just want to call out what I think is the most sort of surprising aspect of these results, which is how tightly the contexts in which a feature activates seem to be coupled to its causal downstream effects. It's not obvious that a feature that activates in response to examples of people writing unsafe code should also cause the model to produce such code itself. But that's what we see pretty robustly across a whole slew of examples. And it suggests, I think something pretty interesting about the way in which the model represents some of these abstractions and how it's kind of sensory and motor elements are how tightly intertwined they are. Beyond that, I'm not sure exactly what to say about it, but I think it's very interesting. Okay, so these are cool cherry-picked examples of interesting features. But let's try to take a step back and look at the bigger picture of what are the 34 million features we found in this autoencoder. And what does the typical one look like? Do they have any structure, et cetera? So first question is, how is it interpretable as the average feature? And if you work at an AI company, the way you do this is you ask language models to tell you how interpretable the features are. So what we do is we show Claude, our language model, samples of data set examples that activate the feature, and then we ask it to come up with an interpretation of what the feature does. Then we ask another instance of the model to take in that proposed interpretation and then also some new examples and rate whether or not the new example has anything to do with the interpretation. And we'd ask it to do it and use this rubric, and we get some statistics. And the takeaway is that these feature interpretations are not perfect, but they're like often decent. Like most of the time when features activate, it has like something to do with the interpretation the model came up with. And also, really importantly, by this metric, the features are substantially more interpretable than the model's neurons, and also substantially more interpretable as the autoencoders we're training are getting larger and larger, suggesting that there's more kind of juice to be squeezed out of this method if we were to scale it further. I will, I guess if you're a careful listener, you might realize that this test kind of measures the specificity of the features, but not their sensitivity. It tells you, like, when a feature activates, does the text have something to do with the interpretation? It doesn't tell you whether the feature always activates when the text has to do with that interpretation. To try to get at that, we construct this harder test where we ask the language model, given a proposed interpretation of the feature, and a block of text to simulate how active the feature would be, solely on the basis of this one sentence description of what it does. And it can kind of get 0.4 correlation with ground truth. So yeah, I think this suggests, which is not that great. It's kind of cool that this works at all, but it's in absolute terms, not what you want. So I think there's a real limitation of our method, which is that our descriptions of what these features represent are usually pretty good. They're not wrong, they're not totally off, but they tend to be much coarser than what the thing actually does represent and fail to capture a lot of the subtleties. So that's kind of an open problem for us. Okay, another thing you might want to know is how comprehensively do these autoencoder uncovered features cover the space of all of the things in the world, whatever that means. So how do we get a handle on that? We try some kind of case studies. So here what we've done as an example is we've taken all the chemical elements in the periodic table, and we just ask whether each of our sparse autoencoders has a feature that corresponds to each chemical element. And the criteria is it needs to fire on mentions of that element, but not the other elements. And we've ranked the elements in order of frequency with which they occur in the training data set. And yeah, broadly speaking, what you find is that autoencoders infer features corresponding to more common elements first, but as the autoencoder gets bigger, it finds more and more, and the coverage gets more comprehensive. And we repeated this exercise across kind of a whole bunch of different categories of things, like lists of cities, lists of animals, lists of foods, and you kind of get the same story each time. The probability that the autoencoder is going to have some feature decays as a function of its frequency in the natural language text corpus. But also, the bigger the autoencoder you train, you kind of push that frontier out further and further. Okay, I'll skip that. Yeah, so that gives us a bit of a macroscopic sense of the breadth of the kind of coverage of these autoencoders. We'd also like to have kind of a more microscopic sense of how fine-grained and specific they can be, and also whether there's some structure to the features. Are they all just pointing in random directions in the model activation space, or does their geometry kind of encode semantics somehow? So yeah, one way to get at this is you can take some features and look at their embedding vectors in the model, and then just plot a UMAP of all the nearby features, where proximity is measured by cosine similarity of the embedding vectors. And so here's an example of doing that for the Golden Gate Bridge feature that we talked about earlier. So each circle here is a feature, the different colors come from the different size autoencoders, and the text labels are these LLM-generated feature interpretations. They might be too small to read, I'm not sure. But yeah, what you find is that everything here is kind of semantically related to the Golden Gate Bridge in some way. So on the left, we've got San Francisco-related features. On the right, there's features having to do with coastal areas or waterways. On the bottom, we have features corresponding to famous landmarks. So there's they kind of cluster together according to some notion of their meaning, but in ways that maybe you wouldn't have predicted a priori. So you can kind of learn a lot by just staring at these plots. And yeah, this works for more abstract features as well. This feature activates on descriptions of people experiencing inner conflicts or being torn between two things. And yeah, if you look at its neighborhood, there's these clusters of features that all have to do with inner conflict, but in different ways. And I can't really do justice to this with a static image, but if you look at our paper, there's an interactive version of this that you can click around, and also we'll link to that in the tutorial, because yeah, I find these pretty fascinating. Okay, I'm going to finish off with kind of a crazy section. Yeah, but hopefully not too crazy, where, yeah, some little experiments we did to kind of like get at the notion of like what the model's representation of itself is. So yeah, Claude 3 Sonnet, the model we studied here, is a model that's been fine-tuned from a base model to act like a chatbot instead of a next word predictor. And part of the way that's done is like all the dialogue you have with Claude is wrapped in these human assistant tags. And something we noticed is that there's a feature, one feature in one of the sparse autoencoders that consistently activates on the assistant token and like the colon following it. And when we look at the data set examples that activate that feature, it's kind of like a mix of like colons that introduce dialogue and also on the word assistant. And if you deactivate this feature, if you like perturb the model in the opposite of this feature's embedding direction, you can cause it to forget that it's an AI. Normally, if you ask the model who it is, it says like, I'm a large language model created by Anthropic. But you can sort of turn off that persona by disabling this feature. Okay, so that feature is kind of like tied up in the model's representation of like what it is, in the sense that it activates basically whenever you ask the model anything in this like human assistant formatting. We were also interested in just like what activates when you ask the model to like introspect explicitly. So what we did was we put in the 4 prompts on the left, which are all like asking the model like how it's doing or how it's feeling. And then we took the set of features that activate in response to all 4 of these prompts. And then we filtered out the features that also activate in response to someone asking like, how's the weather today? Just to like get rid of the boring stuff like features that encode like question marks or the assistant token or whatever. And yeah, so what we found was, this is like the list of features that met the criteria. Like this is not like cherry picked or anything. And it's just like every one of them is fascinating. So yeah, just going from the top, like you've got one feature that's saying you're doing fine when you're not actually doing fine. Then we got one that like represents ghosts or spirits. We got like a feature that's like a bunch of like robot or AI related features, including a like AI posing existential threat to humanity feature. You've got a like characters that are trapped in boxes feature. You've got toward on the bottom right, there's a characters becoming aware that they're in a story. So there's just like, it's just kind of like every like wild sci-fi idea you might have had is sort of like in this figure. And obviously all this is like rooted in the training data, so there's no like magic here. It's been like, model presumably has like been trained on a bunch of stories about AI, and it's like fine-tuned to know that it's an AI, and so it's like stitched those associations together. But like the fact that it's done it in these particular ways, and the fact that you can like see that using this sparse autoencoder methodology is like, kind of wild to me. Yeah, okay, so I'll end by just like gesturing at some of the open questions in this field. One is we need to be able to more precisely interpret what these features represent. As I said, we're not quite there yet. We also need to go from this understanding we have of model representations into an understanding of its computations. So how do these features like wired up together into circuits? Lots of people are working on that. There's a question of scaling. Our autoencoders are bigger than the original model, so they can get expensive if you scale them up, or in the sense of like, yeah, to scale them up, enough to find like all the features, whatever that means, it might be kind of prohibitively expensive, so we need to find kind of clever ways around that. There's also questions about whether sparsity is like the only prior you want. There's probably other kinds of structure to be looking for in model representations besides that, like maybe higher level structure, kind of analogs of brain regions or cell types. And then kind of something that's still outstanding is whether any of this can be useful for like real applications. It's one thing to kind of like stare at some, oh, here's like what the model is like representing when you put in this prompt, but it's another thing to use that to like improve the model's like reliability or whatever it is that you care about in a way that's better than other methods. So we're gonna have a tutorial later. It's gonna be, you're gonna train a sparse autoencoder on some toy data with known ground truth structure. Then you're going to work a little bit with an autoencoder that's been trained on a smaller language model, and you can do some of this like visualization of like what examples it activates for. And then we're going to look at some like public tools that are out there for like interacting with sparse autoencoder features that are trained on like bigger, closer to state-of-the-art LLMs, so you can like kind of interactively play with some of these wilder things yourself. And yeah, some folks helped me put together the tutorial, so I want to thank them and thank organizers for inviting me here. Obviously, my team, who I like play. Yeah, it's a big team. Most of the work I described here was not done by me. And yeah, obviously you all for listening. Thanks.
Hi, nice talk. So you could imagine that with the dimensionality reduction that's happening in the encoding layer, you could have any combination of different features that's packed into one channel, right? So with the examples that you showed are described exactly in one sentence. Do you think it's a coincidence, or is it a constraint that you applied to those channel descriptions?
Could you say again, is what a coincidence? I just missed that, yeah.
So you described those features. So the model output of the meaning of those features happened to be exactly one sentence.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It could be arbitrarily complex, right? Do you think it's a meaningful and interesting result that it is this way, or is it merely a constraint that you applied? Thanks.
Yeah, I think so. So this is kind of what we try to get at with these like quantifications of feature interpretability. It's kind of like how well can they be described by one sentence. I think there's definitely a lot going on that I think, yeah, kind of related to the talk earlier, like the models presumably form some abstractions that are unintuitive to us as humans and like would require a lot of words to express. Like, you know, it might not be just the Golden Gate Bridge. Maybe it's like the Golden Gate Bridge in the context of text that's like written in a certain style and so on. And it's kind of hard to tell that from looking at the examples. So yeah, I think we're only kind of like halfway to like understanding exactly what these things represent. But I think the reason that this approach is promising is because like it does feel like we are halfway and not like 1% of the way.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great talk. I'm curious, in what ways have the functionality that you've already developed actually helped solve problems within the company? And what are the biggest gaps? Like, what are the things that you're sort of shooting for?
Yeah, I think, I mean, this kind of like big at-scale science of the interpretability of these large models is like in really early days. Like when we put this paper out in like May, it was the first time anyone had tried anything like this. So I think we're still kind of in, you know, it's very like basic science-y at the moment. Obviously, like we'd like for this to feed into, you know, making the models like more reliable and safe and like not say bad things and not get jailbroken and like not like deceive the user. But yeah, it's sort of, yeah, maybe ask again in a year kind of, yeah.
So it's none of it is being used right now? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I guess like we kind of like just did this. So it's like, yeah, before that we were working with like toy models. So it's like, yeah, they're just TBD, I guess is the answer.
Thank you.
I guess I have a related question to the first one. So when you're looking at what activates, you know, these particular things, how do you know that it's not something that's disjunctive? So how do you know it's not Golden Gate Bridge and something more obscure that like doesn't pop out from all of the instances?
Yeah, it like
Golden Gate Bridge or.
Yeah, Golden Gate Bridge or, yeah. So yeah, the word we use for that is like, is the feature monosemantic or polysemantic? Does it like, is it accurately described by one thing or multiple things? Typically when you look at neurons, if you do the same kind of like visualizations for neurons, they tend to represent like multiple things. So like the reason people got excited about this in the first place is that like, at least to some extent, it really seems like these features are like described by one rule. Obviously, they're not entirely, especially if you look at examples that like only weakly activate the feature. often those, like some other stuff, it kind of starts to get mixed in there.
I guess I'm asking like how you know that it's monosemantic rather than polysemantic, given that you haven't looked at all possible inputs or contexts.
Yeah, I think so I think the best like test we have, which we're like not actually doing that well on, so it's like a thing to be worried about, is this one where you like, given the interpretation, can you predict the features activations on like a really broad, like the whole data set that we use to train the SAE. And like, if you can do that based solely on this like one sentence description, then it feels like you can be confident that that's capturing like almost all of what activates the feature, or at least like all of what activates the feature that appears in the corpus that you're doing the evaluation on. There's obviously concern about like out of distribution stuff, which we need to think about how to deal with that. But yeah, I think that's like how we think about this is like we want to push that number up. Yeah.
I guess a related question. I was wondering if the limited specificity that you mentioned is due to the sort of cramming of multiple axes within a lower dimensional space, and whether it's this kind of immutable thing in the models, or whether you think they are like in principle orthogonal or can be orthogonalized. Yeah, that's my question.
So you're asking like, does the fact that like the vectors kind of cluster by meaning have something to do with the fact that they're not fully interpretable? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there is a relation there in that like, yeah, so the kind of original like theory of the superposition idea, the whole point was that like actually mathematically it's possible to have like essentially like an exponential number of vectors that are mutually almost orthogonal in an n-dimensional space. So in principle you could have like as many as you want that are mutually almost orthogonal. In practice that's not what we find. The model chooses to embed some things more similarly to each other than others. And so the question is like, why is it doing that? And like your best guess of why is it doing that is that by putting things with like similar downstream effects or similar meanings close together, that kind of like makes it easier for the model weights to like operate on these features. And so yeah, maybe what's happening is like when you're looking at one feature, it does like secrecy in the context of like mystery novels, but then there's another one that's secrecy in the context of like talking about politics, and then they're all clustered together and you're only seeing these like really hyper-specific subsets of secrecy. I think that's like a very, very plausible like hypothesis for what is going on.
Cool, thanks, very fascinating.
Thank you for the presentation. We saw a lot of concepts about stuff that like was present in the training data, but one of the coolest capabilities of these models is in-context learning. And I wanted to ask, have you guys tried looking for features for stuff that's like defined in context?
Yeah, very good question. There's some really cool work from other groups on like, the term is function vectors, where like, yeah, if you do in-context learning of like, where input X, output Y, and then it's some function, like the model will like store a kind of representation of that function, and like similar functions are like similar vectors kind of. And so we might want to look for the same thing with features. Like we might want to see if you do like input X, output Y, and it's always like X times 2, like maybe we'll find like a doubling feature active. But for kind of more sophisticated things, like I think there's a question of whether this feature description is like the appropriate abstraction for these more like algorithmic or like compositional like things. And we're kind of unsure. I think it's very possible that an additional abstraction is needed to like really understand if like the X to Y mapping is like some crazy function that no one's heard of before, and the model doesn't have a feature dedicated to that function. How would we describe it in this language? I'm not sure we know that yet.
Thank you.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. I was wondering if this type of technique has been applied to interpret the effect of fine-tuning. And I don't know if you trained on a new corpus of a certain journal, so the sycophant feature becomes stronger, something like that. And if at a technical level there may be a connection between the sparse representation you're learning and the low dimension that something like LoRa learns to fine-tune transformers.
Yeah, this is like a super natural thing to want to study. Like, how do you understand fine-tuning in the basis of these features, and like, do some get like stronger, or does it like form new features when you fine-tune the model or something? I don't know the answers to those questions, but I expect that many people will be studying them. Yeah.
Maybe next year.
I don't know if I should be like kicked off soon, but okay, let's do one more. Yeah, one more quick question. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask how much you and your team have been thinking about the relationship between features at different layers. In neuroscience, we know that there's hierarchical processing with lower level features, giving rise to higher level features with more abstraction. So how much have you looked into that?
Yeah, so yeah, this paper, we just like did it on one layer, which is like obviously, not what you ultimately want to do. So yeah, this kind of thing like is exactly what we're looking at now. And like, but to tell you about like some results from other groups, like, I mean, what people are kind of starting to do is, is like, if you train an autoencoder at every layer, you've developed some method of like saying like which ones are like influencing which other ones like in later layers, and then you can kind of like stitch together some understanding of how the model computed things like in terms of these features. And you'd imagine that there's like some kind of like hierarchy of abstraction where like the early layer features are going to be like words, and the middle layer like concepts, and then at some point it has to like de-tokenize and give you like predicted next word features. And I think people have like seen kind of stuff like that, but it's just, the meta answer to your question is like, it's really early days, like not that many people have just like done this at all. So like, we'll probably know the answer to that soon, but stay tuned, yeah. Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah.
All right, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our next and final speaker in this session, Dr. Dirisha Kodidiputi, who is the endowed Robert McDermott Chair of Engineering and a professor in the departments of Computer Science and Electrical Engineering at the University of Texas, San Antonio. And she's a very accomplished scholar. You can start setting up. Whose work focuses on building the next generation of AI systems that solve problems in a way similar to the way that we humans solve them. And the particular topic that she's going to be telling us about today is the problem of continual learning, which is about how can you continue to learn new things without forgetting the old things that you've learned about in the more distant past. And beyond her work at the University of Texas, she's also the founding director of the Matrix AI Consortium of Human Wellbeing, where she leads impressively a team of over 80 AI scientists from government, industry, academia, and healthcare to tackle some of the most pressing problems of today's time. So join me in welcoming Dirisha Kodidiputi.
Thank you, Nico, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's indeed my pleasure to be here joining at CCN for the second time. We attended, me and my PhD student, Nicholas Soares, at that time, we attended the first CCN held at Columbia University and presented our work on neurogenesis and how it helps in boosting performance of deep neural networks. So it's really a pleasure to see how well the conference has grown, and share some of our recent work in continual learning and catastrophic forgetting. And this is in collaboration with Guido, who is going to give a tutorial later in the day. And most of the work that I'm sharing today is in collaboration with several of my students in the Neuromorphic AI lab. So let's start with a small interactive exercise. I'm guessing some of you in the audience might know this alphabet. So I'd like everyone to take a moment and take a look at this alphabet in Telugu. Okay. Let's just think about that alphabet for a second. Okay. So now let's look at this Bengali alphabet. Let's take a second here. Okay. And then we are going to pause for a second again. So now let's do a quick test on what you've learned. Can anyone tell me which letter, or which language does this letter belong to? Yes, please. A very good guess. Yes, the shape cues helped us recognize what we have learned, and you're able to immediately apply it, and you're not forgetting what you have learned in the first alphabet. And though you learned a different alphabet, you are able to retain the knowledge and identify which language it belonged to. So humans seem to be doing this very efficiently, so we call this continual learning. So if we have to define it in a simple terms, it's the problem of incrementally learning from a non-stationary stream of data. So when we say non-stationary here, we mean the distribution of data from what is learned changes over time. And what we mean by incrementally in this context is that whatever new learning we are doing, for example, in this case, new language or a new alphabet in Bengali, should not override what you have learned before, but knowledge should be accumulated. So this seems to be a key aspect of intelligence, and as I mentioned, or as we have seen, humans arguably seem to be better at learning continually throughout their lifetime. However, a lot of deep neural networks largely lack this ability of continually learning, especially when we are comparing this performance with the biological counterparts. So we had this fun project with DARPA a few years back that was kicked in 2018 called the Lifelong Learning Machines. We were looking at what this lifelong learning or continual learning problem is in a simple representation. So during the course of this project, this was kind of the chart we all, or the program manager gave to us at the beginning of the kickoff meeting for this lifelong learning machines. So what it's trying to say is if you look at conventional AI or machine learning models versus what we want a continual learning machine to do. So on the x-axis there, you see the model lifetime. On the y-axis, you see the model performance. So when you look at a conventional AI model, compared to what it was trained on, when a new task is introduced to this model, you can see that the performance is dropping significantly. And you can call this catastrophic forgetting because this is not able to adapt to new tasks or new types of learning. Whereas if you look at a continual learning model, it should be able to adapt to this new task, the one which you see in the green plot there, but not only adapt, but also when a previous task is reintroduced to the model, it should be able to perform better than what it did before. And that's a pretty daunting task on how you can achieve this. There are lots of machine learning researchers and teams who are looking at this problem, but one approach to addressing the continual learning problem can take inspiration from neuroscience concepts. And that's kind of the perspective on the right that you see the cartoon from the Nature Machine Intelligence article. This is about 44 authors we have worked on how to design these continual learning systems when you're taking inspiration from the biological counterparts. So you can think of this as neuroscience trying to inspire new types of deep learning algorithms, and these algorithms help perhaps validate or inspire new scientific hypotheses that would benefit the neuroscience researchers. And indeed, there is a growing research interest in the continual learning domain, as you can see in the list of publications, the rapid increase in the number of publications in this domain. And I do not use the term lifelong learning here as much, but you can think of continual learning as a subset of lifelong learning. There are research communities which agree that both lifelong learning and continual learning are similar, but there is lots of ongoing discussion on whether they are similar or whether there are differences in what we mean by lifelong versus continual. So in our research lab, what we do is really look at designing this new generation of intelligent systems that can perform natural tasks similar to these biological counterparts. But our interest is really to do this in the most energy efficient way. And that is why we really look at biological systems, or more specifically in this context, the brain, as a source of inspiration. The challenge is, though, that oftentimes, if you look at the biological or artificial neurons or the studies that come in from our neuroscience colleagues, a lot of them are focused on extensive low-level details on the molecular biology, or in some cases, some of the cognitive concepts. And of course, none of these studies are motivated to fit in the computational or computing researchers or computer engineering researchers. And when we look at translating some of these concepts, there are no building blocks to pass off from one level to the other. So this is really an interesting problem space we work in, and we do collaborate quite a bit with computational neuroscientists, theoretical neuroscientists, but also machine learning and hardware researchers. So I'll come back to this slide later in the talk. So let's talk about why is continual learning difficult. So if we look at a simple example here, when an artificial neural network is sequentially trained on two tasks, let's talk about the orange as one task and the blue boxes you see as task 2. So when you train on these two tasks, it rapidly and drastically forgets what it has learned in the first task when you see the second task is sequentially introduced. Ideally, we do not want this performance drop to happen in our models. So if they're trained in an interleaved fashion with this task 1 and task 2 that you can see over there, it could address this problem of catastrophically forgetting what it has learned in the past and still perform gracefully on the new task. So in this talk, what I'll do is try to cover the types of continual learning and what are some of the key features we are thinking when you're building these continual learning systems, and the computational strategies we use to address continual learning. And I couldn't help, because I'm a computer engineer by training, but to plug in the hardware considerations. So what are the types of, what exactly do we mean by the different types of continual learning? So Guido has done this really good example, a very simple example with a data set some of you might be very familiar with. It's called the MNIST data set. So you can split this data set into multiple tasks, as you see in the cartoon here, task 1 to task 5. And the network or the model should learn these tasks in a sequential manner. And after all the tasks have been learned, the model should be good at all of them. Like I've shown earlier, it shouldn't have any catastrophic drop in its performance. And usually, in a lot of these cases, the models are only storing a small amount of data that they have seen in the past, and not all the data that they have seen in the past, because you want it to actually learn, not just recall. So if we look at this example, and we can think of these tasks as, or these continual learning scenarios into 3 types. So you can look at this flow chart on the right there. At test time, you have to see if the task label is given. Yes, then it's a task incremental. If there is no task label given, and is the task label inferred, then it's domain incremental. And if it's not inferred, it's domain incremental. And if it is inferred, it's class incremental. What do I mean by this? So if we look at a task incremental learning, in this specific example of the split MNIST, the choice is for the network to choose to choose the digits from a known task. So in this case, for task 1, it should be able to identify between 0 and 1, or task 2 between 2 and 3. And it's often considered a trivial problem in the continual learning scenarios. And the second one is the domain incremental. Here, the choice is still between the two options, whether in this case you're looking at all of them and seeing whether the digit is odd or even. And the last one, which is considered the most difficult one, is the class incremental learning. So the network must choose between all the 10 digits. It has a choice between all the 10 digits. So that is the most challenging problem in the continual learning scenarios. And put it in a different way to drive this point home, you can think of task incremental learning as incrementally learning a set of clearly distinguishable tasks. So in other words, the challenge in this scenario, what we are trying to solve is achieve positive transfer between the tasks. And the next one is the domain incremental. So, but here, like, think of an autonomous vehicle, like a car, that is driving in different scenarios, on a foggy day versus a clear day, on a rugged road versus a clear road. So it should be able to learn the same type of problem in different contexts. So in this scenario, you're trying to address the catastrophic forgetting problem. And in the third one, we are increasingly growing the number of classes, and it has to incrementally learn, as in when new input is provided, it should be able to learn in this context. So here we are trying to solve to discriminate between objects that are not traditionally or what are observed together. So that's why this becomes a little bit more challenging. So if you think of what are the features of this continual learning, so in this article we have published during the DARPA program, we've listed a set of key features that these lifelong learning systems should exhibit. And we would say the continual learning systems should also have support these features. So one of which I've already talked about, which is you don't want this model to catastrophically forget what it has learned in the past. The second one, sorry, I'll take a pause here, step back. Here, the task on the top, what you see is that the model is given a different set of tasks, in this case, a robotic arm, which is picking an object, dropping an object, and folding a box, and then the tasks could be reintroduced to the model. So the model should have the ability to transfer and adapt. In other words, it has to apply the previous knowledge to new tasks or variants of these tasks when they're introduced. But these could be non-identical variants that the model might be seeing. The second one is exploiting task similarity. So in this case, rather than the model trying to learn a monolithic representation of a task, it should be able to decompose the task into multiple subtasks and leverage the knowledge it has from those subtasks when they are part of the newer task. So that's what is shown in here, like, positioning, gripping, and other activities you can decompose and reuse this knowledge when a different task is introduced to the model. And the next one is called task-agnostic learning. In a lot of models that you see out there in the deep learning models, they know when the task is being switched, but in real-world scenarios, in a lot of contexts, you do not know when the task switch is actually happening. So the model should be able to know that the new task is introduced without explicitly being told so and perform well in those environments. And ability to tolerate noise and still perform well, noise that it hasn't seen in the training environment. And the last one, perhaps a very important one and something that is very close to my heart, is the ability to learn continually with very minimal resources. Because in all of these scenarios or features that we are talking about, they demand more compute resources, more memory resources. And there are arguments that especially if you want to replay some of this knowledge back to the model, the memory can get unbounded in certain scenarios. So how do you address this challenge while retaining that or keeping the resources in a constrained fashion? So let's look at a few of the computational strategies that we use for continual learning. So this is from the book chapter Guido, Nick, and me have written earlier this summer. So if you can kind of think of grouping these continual learning methods, you can group them into 6 subsets. One is replaying, which is like your current training data is complemented with some form of replay data that is representative of the past samples. The second one is called parameter regularization. So here you add a penalty term to the loss to encourage the parameters that are important in the past task to not change. Similar is functional regularization, but here you're looking at the network dynamics. And gradient optimization, here we are trying to modify the way the loss function is optimized. Context-dependent processing, perhaps this audience might be more familiar with the terms neurogenesis, pruning, synaptogenesis, synaptic pruning. These kinds of techniques would fall under context-dependent processing, where you're adding new resources or pruning the resources when you do not need them to solve a specific task. And the last one is template matching. So for each class in the template that it has learned, the test samples are classified based on which class template is most suitable to them. So later in the tutorial, we are going to cover the top 3, replay, parameter regularization, and functional regularization of the popular examples that are out there in deep learning. But I wanted to show you how there are several continual learning algorithms that do take inspiration from the plasticity, either the structural or the synaptic plasticity or the topological references that we see in the brains. So if we look at attention, for example, or context-dependent processing, there are models that do that, like the dynamic architectures, or there are techniques that have replay and rehearsal embedded in deep learning models. And there are a whole slew of techniques on the left here that you see incorporate neuromodulation, plasticity, metaplasticity, or in general, other forms of neural plasticity. And these could be solving problems in the spatial domain or temporal domain, or in domains where there is active interaction with the environment. And in this article, we were thinking about how some of these mechanisms can be used to solve the key features that we have listed for continual learning. I know there is a lot of information in this plot here, and I would say that we've discussed about this chart for almost 4 months because there are 44 co-authors, and it was not easy to come to an agreement as to what biological mechanism corresponds to what feature in the continual learning, or what are the demonstrated models right now. A dot, for example, here shows that you see the first technique there, neurogenesis, has in transfer and adaptation and exploiting task similarity or catastrophic forgetting. It does not mean the problem is fully solved with this technique, but it only shows that there are some initial models that demonstrate there is potential for this biological mechanism to be applied or to solve or address this specific aspect of continual learning. So I would talk about a few of the techniques we have developed in our lab that might more resonate with the audience here, not as much on the deep learning models that Guido would cover later in the tutorial. So one of the ones is to kind of use metaplasticity and consolidation as we are building these types of models and see if they can learn continually. So the idea here is that we want to protect the previous knowledge that is encoded in important synapses. And the way we incorporate this metaplasticity is based on the activity, or you could track the weight change of the synapse, or you could look at the temporal correlation, or use something like spike time dependent plasticity in your models. So what we are trying to do here is we are trying to reduce the plasticity of the previously active neurons to prevent them from being overwritten. And we are encouraging the plasticity of the inactive neurons, or we are encouraging these inactive neurons to respond to multiple stimuli. That's what we are trying to do with this metaplasticity incorporated in our model. The next one is consolidation. Here we are trying to accumulate the knowledge over multiple timescales into the model. So the way we designed it is each model has a fast-moving and a slow-moving weight component. The fast-moving component is driven by some task-specific learning and regulated by metaplasticity, and the slow component consolidates the information learned on a longer time scale. And we also have something called heterosynaptic weight decay that allows the slow component to influence the fast component. So a way to think about this is the fast component is a traditional synaptic weight, and the slow component can be a reference weight which consolidates the knowledge over a longer time scale. So we kind of take all of this and bundle into this network that you see. It's a simple model. We call this tacos. We're from San Antonio, and we love our tacos. But mainly because it's a task-agnostic learning model, so that's where the tacos name comes from. So the network here consists of two layers of neurons. These are leaky integrate fire neurons, and each of these has two compartments, one to accumulate forward pass, and the other one accumulates error signals in the backward pass. And we train this using some kind of surrogate gradient learning rules. And the weight updates occur whenever there's a presynaptic spike occurs or a postsynaptic spike satisfies some types of boxcar function. So what we try to observe here is the combination of this metaplasticity and synaptic consolidation can help us prevent catastrophic forgetting. So that's what we demonstrate this, in this work that was published a few years back. I know these plots are pretty hard to read, but the summary here is we show that when we combine these techniques, the model performs gracefully and does not lose track of information it has learned in the past. And this specific plot is showing what we have done with a split MNIST task. And the beauty of this model, it is task agnostic, but also it is learning in a single epoch, so which means it is highly memory efficient and resource efficient. We kind of expanded this to another model, which we call NEO, where we are not just looking at metaplasticity on itself, we are looking at the neuron activation-dependent metaplasticity. And we combine this with selective local learning, and the idea really with NEO was to take on what we have done in tacos and see if we can do this continual learning with higher memory efficiency. So we were able to get performance similar to the state-of-the-art models with 2 to 3 times lower memory requirements. And then we did some very early work on context-dependent learning, which is what I was mentioning earlier, could be neurogenesis or pruning. So here we kind of have a slow-growing network. This is more a reinforcement learning type of network. Based on the task it's learning, it would increase the number of neurons or synapses, and we do selective pruning, and we have a huge set of rules by which we have guided this model to perform this relational neurogenesis and achieve continual learning. So, well, this is all great, but I've mentioned about the challenge with what are the resources we need, and is it sustainable to build these types of models? So if you look at AI compute, currently it's doubling every 3.5 months, and costs are decreasing by 1 order every 4 to 12 years. And you might have seen some of the training costs for the top models are significantly high, which is about $10 million. And if you look at this plot on the left here, it shows example on some of the consumption, acceleration years, energy consumption for different popular models. So really a paradigm shift is needed, even on the hardware side, to think about how we support these type of growing demands from the compute. And especially if you're thinking of continual learning models, you really need to work very closely with the hardware designers. And whereas, if you look at the other side, there seems to be a lot of efficiency that we observe in the biological brains. And so can we take some inspiration from these biological brains as we are building the hardware, specifically neuro-inspired hardware? So, we kind of presented some early ideas on this concept in a paper that is listed in here on how do you think about building these kind of accelerators, AI accelerators that take on the principles that we want for continual learning and also take biological principles and build better hardware systems. So if you look at this specific plot, I kind of split it into resource constraint versus resource growing. Because in silicon or in hardware, I do not know how to do neurogenesis because though I have a lot of flexibility in reorganizing some of the components, I do not have a way to generate new components. I do not know how to do a potential synapse in silicon. So there are a lot of interesting and challenging problems here on how we can think about bringing these kinds of algorithms into hardware. We've started some early work in this domain we just incorporated metaplasticity in our hardware, and we taped out this chip out of SUNY Albany, and we are currently testing this chip. And hopefully this publication is going to go out later this year. So where do we go from here? So I said I'll come back to this original slide. I know there was this huge theme that was there at AAAS meeting this year, do science without walls. I think it's really, really important as we are thinking about this next generation of AI algorithms or systems that we really have to work across disciplinary boundaries. So it's very important that we, hardware designers or computer engineers or computer scientists, work very closely with the neuroscientists to understand some of these concepts that seem to have shown some early promise in both models or hardware and just build better AI systems. And of course, in computing, the application areas drive a lot of these research. There is an increasing need to have these continual learning features in autonomous systems. There is an increasing need for personalization and specialization in a lot of embedded and edge devices that you are using on a daily basis. And perhaps it can facilitate modeling for computational neuroscience researchers here. This cartoon that you see on the right is a simulation environment that my student Tej has built during the DARPA project to show how the neurogenesis algorithm he has built is working well in the rescue and search operations in a photorealistic environment. So looking forward, I hope there are more new neuroscience findings that would help us in building new types of continual learning algorithms. We've kickstarted a project called BRAID, or Emerging Frontiers Research Initiative from NSF, where we are looking at the temporal scaffolding hypothesis that my colleague Itamar Lerner has built and see how we can do replay in a very efficient way to do continual learning. And there are similarly other projects where we are looking at how to bring in more plasticity into the network so we can build better continual learning models. And as I mentioned, we also have to think about the underlying hardware as to how do we support what we have built at the models or the theory level and build better hardware accelerators. So in one way, we have to think about how we are evaluating these continual learning frameworks and what are the right metrics to evaluate these systems, and can emerging hardware support us in designing these types of systems. So if I have to summarize the takeaways from this talk, continual learning, the skill of incrementally learning from a non-stationary stream of data, is a key aspect of intelligence. And we would say it is one of the grand challenges in the ML community. And experience from neuro-inspired approaches have shown great promise, and how do we progress from here? So there are ways in how we can adopt these plasticity mechanisms incrementally in both machine learning models and spiking neural networks. And I think Matthias mentioned in his keynote that there is a lot of compositionality or compositional models that researchers are looking at. So maybe by combining different types of mechanisms, especially plasticity mechanisms, there is a way to get better continual learning models. And perhaps by adopting incremental advances into silicon, we probably may be able to build better AI hardware and systems. And this is how we feel in our lab, because we have to work with the neuroscientists and machine learning designers and device engineers in order to build efficient computational systems. So we have to ensure that we have this energy efficiency achieved across all abstractions. And so plug, if you're interested in working in such a highly interdisciplinary environment, we have a cluster hire going on, looking for professors, full professors who would be interested in becoming regents, professorships in the neuro-inspired learning area, and lots of postdoc positions and PhD positions available. And shortly, Guido will be giving a talk, I think in the Little Kresge downstairs, on giving you a more hands-on experience of how to build these continual learning systems. And thanks to all the amazing students I get to work with on a daily basis. But before I let you go, test time. Okay, so tell me these letters belong to which language? Louder, please. Telugu? Yes. And you know what these letters stand for is? So you've done class incremental learning there, kind of. But thank you so much for your time.
I was wondering if, for the example that you provided.
It's very hard to hear, sorry.
Sorry? Okay.
All right, so the session is, can we give it 5 more minutes, or if people leave the room, could they be quiet so we can take a few questions, please?
I'm going to ask her directly.
If not, then maybe you can also take the questions live over there. Yes, maybe.
Okay, I'll walk closer to you. Sorry. Yeah, please.
My question is that the example that you provided, classification between these two languages, do you think actually synaptic weight change happened in our brain that time, or it's more like an in-context learning that happens? In-context learning, similar to what happens in transformers. And anyway, what is the main reference for the lifelong learning in humans? I was trained as an electrical engineer, and I just don't remember anything about that.
Yeah, I should give a disclaimer that I'm a computer engineer, but I think, yes, there is a lot of background knowledge that we as humans have, and I think I think some of the symmetry in the language itself, you're seeing that there are some patterns here, and the shape cues and the context, because I already mentioned that it's an alphabet, unlike, some unknown object or shape. So I think a lot of those things help in the learning process. I cannot really separate it out, and I know there is a lot of thought that needs to go into what would be that right experiment to show that sequential learning, and that's what Itamar Lerner, my colleague right now, is actually doing in his lab for the new project we're working on. But I think in general we see that humans do this much better than, at least from Arguably, right? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So, I'm curious. Like, this is fantastic. But like, there's a rapid expanding field of machine learning. Like basically they want to unlearn stuff like some for AI safety, and then like for example like the ministry like they want to unlearn a specific like person's image like for AI safety, which like machine learning is rapidly and like expanding in the AI world, and I actually applied these methods like you listed there on some of the networks. I spent a summer and then it's not working. It's like because like now I want to unlearn. Instead of learning, it's like I want to unlearn a task, and then it's like with mini data set, it's just a small subset of the recognition data set. It's not. It's just collapse, like with the original thing, like original like accuracy. So I just like because like continual learning and targeted unlearning seems like conceptually, like yeah.
I think forgetting is part of our continual learning process in a way. I think what you forget and what you retain is I think what you replay, right? What we rehearse as humans during our sleep. Or I think there's a lot of studies on what aspects are replayed and what we do not actually retain. So forgetting is an aspect of continual learning, but if you are using, like I think, the replay technique as a baseline model and trying to store all the key data elements and then you are trying to unlearn, I think it might be, it might not be the best approach. I think in your replay itself, you might want to think about what aspects are important and what aspects can be forgotten, but I think the researchers are looking at this. There is some kind of conflicting objectives, I understand, but people are looking at this.
Thank you. Thank you for the great talk, and it's really an honor to meet you because I read your paper and I'm a big fan of you. Well, my question is that, like, I believe an important aspect of human continual learning is not only avoiding catastrophic forgetting, but also, taking an advantage of the prior knowledge and employing, like, task similarities, blah blah blah, as you mentioned in your paper, and like split MNIST task, which you mentioned in your talk, is, I guess, it does not gauge the ability to, for example, cache the task similarity or the transferability. So do you have insight on perhaps how can we design this kind of benchmark which can test this kind of ability?
So on the model side, I think researchers are developing like different types of deep learning models that address aspects of continual learning. You have models that do transfer learning very well. You have certain models that are good at adaptability in certain contexts. So, but designing a benchmark or a real-world benchmark is, like you pointed out, is a real challenge. Like in the DARPA project, the team from Johns Hopkins was supposed to be developing a real-world testbed. So there is a paper that came out from that effort on some of the earlier thoughts on what that testbed should look like. But does that address all the features we are looking at is not necessarily possible at this point, because I think the resource efficiency part is a big challenge. So a lot of evaluation frameworks really do not consider that part yet. So this is an active area of work. Even the metrics, right? What are the right metrics? People do not have a common agreement on it yet. So it's still being developed. Thank you.
I guess I wanted to ask kind of broadly, with preventing catastrophic forgetting, firstly, how does reinforcement learning factor into your research as just a general approach? And also, how do you feel about potentially quantum computing in the long run, cutting down compute times, potentially storage costs significantly because of how quickly it can deal with stochastic and combinatoric style problems, which show up a lot in deep learning in general?
The reinforcement learning models that we used are primarily for the context-dependent processing, what I've shown, like neurogenesis and pruning. They're very resource hungry because you are kind of updating the state at every instance, even though we have like a controlled growth of the network because you have to retain that state all the time. They're very expensive. I do not actively work in RL domain, so I think that my knowledge is limited to the neurogenesis pruning, that domain. So for now, I think the approaches we are taking are computationally expensive, though. So we are trying to look at how to reduce that cost. Regarding your question of quantum, yes, I think it would be great to have problems that could be solved in a fast and efficient way. I don't know, but every time I hear or talk to my quantum colleagues, it's always 10 years away. So hopefully that will help us solve some of the, these or the gradient optimization or other things in a much faster way, the combinatorial problems in a faster way. Yeah, but beyond that, I've seen quantum systems. I've work with colleagues who work on quantum computing, but I do not know if we have like an immediate solution that would help us in this space. But we need to keep working towards that. Yeah, thank you.
I have listened to your talk so happily, and I had read your paper. And I have a question about it because I had read the paper in 1991, French, that says that backpropagation is the main problem for the main reason for the catastrophic forgetting. And I think that everything is using backpropagation here. So do you have some intention to any plan to replace the backpropagation to achieve the continual learning?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a lot of debate if backpropagation is a workhorse algorithm still for a lot of things. And what I've shown is surrogate gradient rules. But we use a lot of local plasticity learning mechanisms in our models. So I think some combination of this local plasticity with a global learning rule would help us. But we do not know what that global learning rule is yet. And that's where at least people who are in my domain are working very actively to see what that learning rule looks like. And there are, I don't know, Guido works actively in the deep learning models, and a lot of it is based on backpropagation. Or do you want to comment on this, Guido?
So I don't think backpropagation is necessarily what's causing this sort of forgetting. So, like there are alternatives for backpropagation, but then even how radically different they are because they're still doing sort of gradient-based or at least pseudo-gradient-based implementation.
So maybe the local plasticity is maybe important, but it is very kind of big deal, and it is very kind of unnecessary to replace the whole algorithm for training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but like Guido said, I think not the catastrophic forgetting problem itself is, I think, bigger than just saying it is because of backpropagation. Independent of the training mechanism, I think that problem exists. Like there could be better ways to address it. Maybe some other type of rules can help us address it in a more efficient way or computationally efficient way, but it's not necessarily the source of the problem.
Great talk, and I want to ask a question about cognitive fatigue effects that humans have when they do continual learning. So can we find some ways to model this kind of effect? Did it have some computational functions in continual learning, or it just side effect of limit sources? And is there any corresponding in artificial neural network? This is my question.
I think you're asking, are there ways to evaluate this in a cognitive context? Is that what you're saying? Or can we test it in a cognitive science environment?
Cognitive fatigue means that Fatigue, yeah. You know about the word?
No.
Oh, so cognitive fatigue means that you are mentally tired because you are keep doing one single task or you do a sequence of different tasks. This is what humans do and some other animals do when they are doing sequential tasks or do continual learning. So I'm just curious, artificial neural networks won't have fatigue. So is there any functions of this kind of fatigue effect, or is just the side effect of the consuming of resources in the brain?
Yeah, we haven't, I'm not familiar with the cognitive fatigue, so, but you're saying when we are doing these models inspired by biology, is there a way we are incorporating that into the models, or is there a way that could offer some benefit in terms of resource efficiency? Yeah, we haven't really looked at this, but that's very interesting. I probably should bring this to my neuroscience colleague, who is actually setting up experiments on humans right now. So, yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Like I just asked now, but I just want to have conversations.
I guess we don't need the microphone, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because I